It's about 5 past the hour, and this was more or less the time we thought we might get going on this. So the audience is largely people who have played in the Whitney Cup, and for Chris and Colin, that's the best we have to offer in terms of amateur players. As you both know, it's a trophy that has existed since the 30s, teams, 5 pairs, and from each club, and very popular, played in New York, usually at about this time of year, but obviously not this year. So Bill Barker suggested that we contact those people, and many of them are here. For them, Chris Ronaldson and Colin Lumley are, in addition to being hugely well-known professionals, are deep thinkers about the game, and have been extremely helpful in coming up with a way of doing something that we didn't do before. I'm holding up a spreadsheet that has across the top a listing of 10 courts, and we picked them for reasons of hosting world championships, recently constructed, readily available, and good examples of various courts. And we have created that spreadsheet. The columns are the courts, the rows are the various different measures of different things. Some of you will have seen a story I wrote about the process the other day, and it has been absolutely fascinating, and trying to think through what are we trying to reward or not reward, and really that would be the subject of today's conversation. Ryan would remind me to say that we are recording this so that we can have it on our website, and people can have a look at it at their convenience. And so I thought that what we might do in order to get the most information really from Chris and from Colin would be to set this up as sort of a question and answer. And I have 8 questions that I would ask of them. Ryan is going to monitor the chat function. We can sort of pause at the conclusion of each answer to a question, 8 of them if we spent about 5 minutes on each one, and asked the question fairly quickly, responded, then maybe took a question in that section and then moved on. And then that would leave us maybe 10, 15, 20 minutes for general questions at the end. And those who have commitments at the top of the next hour should certainly feel free to move on at that time. And then if we stayed along for another 10 or 15 minutes, if there are people that are interested, that's kind of the way we looked at it. Sound like a reasonable agenda? Give me a thumbs up on that. Okay. All right. So question number 1. If there were time machines and players could return from each of the 7 to 10 centuries in which the game has been played, we'd like them to see the new court and say, I know that game. I used to play it in 1450 or 1750. Chris, Colin, tell me a little bit more about where that came from. Oh, Colin, you're muted.
Well, while Colin's unmuting himself, I had a bit of a think about that, and I decided I would like the people from 1450 and 1750 to recognize the game, but I think I care more about what they were thinking and how it relates to the game in 1850 and thereafter, from the period at which we have recorded information about the players of the day.
So tell me what you think that they, the Chris Ronaldson of 1850 has just returned and he's here. What's he likely to say?
He's likely to say, crikey, these rackets are tightly strung, because the rackets we used to use then used to have a rough side and a smooth side because all the strings, all the cross strings were wrapped around the main strings rather than being woven through it, which gave you more cut but less tension. So they're going to be shocked at the speed at which the ball is flying.
Okay. And what would you change because of that? Or what would they look at and say, wow, apart from, I mean, what would be the consequence of that? Can the court be would the court have been as long in 1850 as it is now?
Well, there would have been more variation than there is now between the larger courts and the smaller courts, which would have made home court advantage more significant. But it just would have meant there's a lot more floor play and a lot less forcing.
Because you just couldn't hit it hard enough.
Yeah.
Colin, any thoughts on that? You're still muted.
Yes, I can take the mute off. No, I agree fully with Chris. And the racket is, the ball, since I've been playing the game of tennis, the ball travels 50% faster today than it did when I started. And 35% of that is probably down to the development of the racket. In that, the racket used to always split down the center, and they've changed that and made them so much better. So it's the speed of the game that has changed. So that's something that we've tried to combat a little bit. Oops. Sorry about that. By one of the things that Chris has very pointed out is that because the game's getting so much faster, we wanted to try to make the galleries smaller on the new courts. So again, if you got someone from 1700, they'd probably walk onto the court at Chicago and say, boy, those galleries look pretty small compared to the ones at Hampton Court where they're as big as a bucket. So I think we've got the opportunity to move forward with the way that the players have become so much fitter, and the equipment has developed so much more. So we're in the ideal situation that we can try to get a little bit more balance so that, again, the server gets the dominance of the game, so that you don't have someone at the hazard end who's just like Rob Fay's very good at it. Don't get me wrong, they're very good at it, but they, sitting there and watching them ping them into the dead on non-stop, you get amateurs leaving that game thinking, oh, the only way to play this game is to ping the ball into the dead on, which is not what we want. We want to get a good mixture between floor game and the fast game.
Okay, Ryan, is there a question on that one, or should we move on to the second question?
No questions yet, but I'll keep you posted.
All of you, please feel free to use.
I take that back. Jeremy has a question.
Okay.
And I would also suggest if you have a question, submit it in the chat so we know that you do have one.
All right. Well, sorry about that. Hi, Colin. Hi, Chris. Nice to see you both. Hope you're both well. Just curiosity about the court. Is there, maybe I should know the answer to this, but is there, can a new court just totally change the dimensions of, say, the date-on opening or hazard sizes, the bandos, things like that? I mean, if a new, is there a minimum and maximum on how big the openings can be?
There's no set minimum, but what we looked at is when a lot of the courts in about 1905 to 1912 in the UK, they bet about 7 or 8 courts. And by that stage, there was consistency in most of all of the sizes. They were all the same length, they were all the same width. So, and that was they'd probably built 30 courts over that last 30 years. So I think that they'd reached the point where they'd realized what works and doesn't work. Well, there's some courts that were down at, 94 feet, and then you had some that are 114 foot. So there was a great variance in that period. But by the very late end of that period, there is a very consistent size of what they were trying to achieve all the time. And the angles of the timbre didn't change much, and it became very, very consistent. But some of the things we've discussed is, if you go down to Paris and you miss the grill, you very quickly set a hazard chase. And the reason of that is that is 3 foot shorter court from the winning gallery back to the wall. So again, that's not desirable. But these are the sort of things, plus the thing that Chris has always which we addressed at Chicago, is we actually made the the gallery ledges 2 inches higher, so the galleries are smaller in Chicago than they would have originally been, because all the battery walls were removed when they put the lawn tennis in there. And we think, and Steve made a comment a couple of weeks ago, Steve Fagona, the head pro there, that in his view, that has worked, because when he's got new students coming along, they're learning to play the floor game more than just banging it into a gallery.
So there's no set standard of if the court is too short or too wide, or is it basically just what the pros and the international and the associations feel is acceptable or not acceptable for a proper court?
Yeah, there are no set dimensions for court tennis. If you wanted to, you could build the main wall the other side and put the tambour the other side. There's nothing to stop you doing that. It just might not be a very popular court.
Yeah.
Peter Pell had an interesting question about the different, how does the size of court impact, how do you think about it if you're playing singles versus playing doubles? Are there things that you might do if you thought it was, I guess, well, Peter, why don't you ask the question yourself, because I'm trying to paraphrase it.
Yeah, are there certain dimensions of a court that lend themselves to sort of optimal singles play or doubles play? And do you think about that in setting dimensions?
You can think about it, but there's not a lot you can do, because you can't make a specific doubles court. I mean, in general, a singles player, when you're playing singles, you've got a big wide court, and the basic tactic for club players is to hit the ball into a corner. Now, for doubles, you've got a chap in each corner, or a woman in each corner, so that becomes less attractive, and there's greater tendency just to hit the ball hard down the middle or off the walls.
Okay, let's go on to question 2.
Before we go, why is Jeremy trying to scare us by coming in as Peter Bender? Sorry,
okay.
Peter, if you're on, I'm sorry.
It's his thing, Temple. He does it on every tennis related Zoom.
What you
Joke
want
that
to do.
never gets old.
Haven, Steve Sater had a question. I don't know if you see it in the chat.
Yeah, it relates, Steve has a question that relates to the speed of the floor. And what I'd like to do, Ryan, can you try to remember that one? And we'll take it up at the end, since I think what we're trying to do is focus as much as anything on the sort of dimensions and angles. There is plenty of discussion to be had, and we can do it separately, again, on sort of surfaces, materials, and so forth. The interesting thing about dimensions and angles is that they don't have a material cost consequence. The finishes and how you do the floor and those kinds of things can have a big cost consequence. So maybe we'll get through these questions and leave that one until till the end. So, okay, so here was the second observation. Rallies are good, but it is possible to overemphasize fitness and agility. If the points last forever because it's impossible to hit a winner, the game becomes tedious. True or false?
I believe that's true, but I don't think it's applicable to court tennis.
Because it's so hard to keep the rallies going.
Because it's so relatively easy compared with squash to hit a winner.
Colin, do you agree with that? Nodding, muted.
Yes, I would agree with that comment.
Any other thoughts?
You know, I've sat and watched World Championship and really high stuff where you get a rally that goes on for, 15 or 20 hits, and it's just a fantastic rally. And then you go and watch lawn tennis where they're slugging it out for 50 shots in a row. And I think we've got the right balance as I don't think it's a problem in real tennis at this stage, in my view.
Yeah, and squash gets boring, goes on and on and on and on.
Yeah, the fitter the squash players get, the longer on the rallies, and so much to a stage that in professional squash now they lower the tin because it got to the stage where they couldn't hit a winner. So as soon as the men go on for the finals, I mean, they lower the tin by, I don't know how far it is, it's a couple of inches, or maybe. But
They reduced it from 19 inches to 17 inches. Yep.
yeah, which again,
I would liken it somewhat to squash in that an extended rally often involves some dazzling retrieves, and squash and soccer, I'm sorry, often has very little scoring, but you see some dazzling moves. So I'm not sure those extended rallies are necessarily boring. Sometimes they involve some incredible retrieving and shot making.
Yeah, sometimes.
It seems to me that the differences in the shots in real tennis are significant enough that the rallies, they're not repetitive. Whereas it can get repetitive if people are moonballing in tennis. I'm curious, Jim Zug, is this something that has come up in the squash world at all, of more diversity of shot making and so forth to keep it interesting? Is that something that you guys in squash land worry about?
Yeah, I mean, every sport, racket sport has undergone a revolution in the last 30 years in terms of equipment. Every single one, and they've all had ramifications of that, and squash certainly has as well for trying to make it more exciting and reduce the attritional rallies. I agree with Sam completely that it's still very interesting in nuance. It's just not as obvious to the neophyte what's happening out there. And I think we all remember Wimbledon before they changed the grass, that the rallies would be 3 or 4 hits, right? And there was complaints that it was too much serve and volley, and so I think squash is dramatically more exciting than it was 20, 30 years ago. And we did lower the tin, we changed the scoring, so there has been an evolution for sure.
Okay. So the next, I guess these are really not so much questions as they were assertions. And so they become, in a way, true or false questions. So the next one is, there should be a mix of shots hit on the floor and shots hit into the various openings that rewards both shot-making skills and decision-making tactics. And I guess the question would be, what degree of each, or how do you see balancing shots hit into corners and shots hit into galleries?
Well, if I take the lead first on that, I would like to see both, but I'd also like to see exponents of both. Probably the most attractive player I've seen to watch in my 50 years in the game has been someone like Frank Willis. But I wouldn't want to watch a match between Frank Willis and Frank Willis, or Barry Totes and Barry Totes. What you want is the contrast. You want people of a certain size and temperament to play one sort of game, but have a reasonable chance against people who play a different sort of game.
Colin, any thoughts on that?
I think, in my experience, I agree with Chris, but when you go to a club, if you just walked into a club and you didn't know who the pro was and you sat there for a whole day, at the end of the day, you'd have some idea who the pro was, because a lot of the courts, the pro makes their people. So if you've got someone that's very good at a railroad and you go to a court, you'll probably find that the amateurs are very good at a railroad as well, because that person, whereas poor old Barry Totes, used to, and this is no exaggeration, he used to be able to get 2 bounces from a shot into the backhand corner at the service end. He would then return that and he would get 2 bounces before it hit the timbre. Today, if you ask the top players to do that, I just don't think they'd be able to do it. But Barry's control, so all the members there used to play beautiful long floor games. And and Chris and I are both of the view that we need to maybe reel in the hard hitting a little bit and try to get more of the floor game back. And that's why we're looking at the height of the galleries, ledges to help us achieve that. We also are looking at, maybe the ball has been the same virtually since I've been in the game, 40 odd years, and maybe we are not changing the ball enough. James mentioned about squash. Well, when I played with squash, we all played with a yellow ball, and then occasionally on a cold day you might get out a red, whereas now they've got double yellows and double reds and all sorts of things. So games do evolve, and maybe real tennis is a time to maybe be looking at the ball a little bit more. But we do want to take the opportunity we've got here is to not make it so that people can just slam them into the galleries non-stop. And there was a question earlier about how courts were made to certain things. Well, the court at Petworth, the person who built that court was not a very good player, but he used to love sliding the ball down in the backhand corner. But because he wasn't very good, he actually built the net post 6 inches low at the net on the gallery side than the main wall, so that he could play that shot. So yes, in the old days, people used to build courts to what they want, but we're not proposing that, because we're just trying to make it so that as a standard, the galleries are becoming too much pumping, so cut them back a little bit. We're proposing also not to bring the grill height ledge up at the same, so the grill would be slightly larger or lower ledge than the galleries, because you don't want to be penalising someone who hits the grill. You don't want to make it even a smaller target.
Ivan, picking up on Colin's point about being able to go to a club, watch the players, and determine essentially what the pro was good at. Can you give us, is there a personal experience that you could share about Prince's Court from the years that you've been here? What do you think Colin would say about you if he came and watched all of us playing? What have you been encouraging?
He might notice that some of our younger players have forces that look like golf swings, and he'll see a lot of underarm twists. But apart from that, not a lot.
And is the underarm twist because that's what you found works best on this court, on the existing?
The cut sidewall works best on this court, but the different variations of the underarm twists are under-taught in the US, I think.
And I think if you went along to, say, Radley currently, or Hampton Court in the old days when Chris was there, those players had a greater variance of serves than, say, other professionals, because Chris was always so good at the variety of serves that he'd reached to a very high standard. So I think that Chris encouraged more people to use different serves at the clubs he's at.
Temple here, getting back to Ivan, all you have to do is, there's a picture of it. Ivan shattered a glass panel at Prince's Court, and we should have kept the shards and put them in an urn someplace, but that's how hard Ivan hits it. So it's interesting about hitting it hard and maybe not hitting as hard, all that, the contrast, pretty good.
Bill Barker asked an interesting question. Can you think of a court, and he prefers one in the US, but probably anywhere would do, that tends to over-reward forcing, or one that is too favorable to the floor game? Is there an extreme at either of those that comes to mind?
Well, New York is I remember Wayne Davies when he's world champion, and I hadn't seen this before with him at New York, but he used to be able to get so much cut on his volley returner serve that he would actually get it cutting down off the main wall before it even got to the back wall. So that's one extreme but he was very talented, of course, but that court was very much that way. I'll leave Chris to answer the question. He might have one.
I'm not quite sure what would be perceived as by club players, but the odd court out when I was playing back in the 80s was always Philadelphia, because it was such a slow court. The ball didn't used to cut down. There definitely used to be longer rallies at Philadelphia than there were elsewhere.
Got it. Steve Hufford asked an interesting question about penthouse angles, and that is, are they all the same? Are all the penthouses the same slope?
The answer is they're not the same. And that was one of the critical questions we looked at, because the steeper you have a penthouse, the more favorable it is for the server. The flatter you have the penthouse, like New York, the more favorable it is for the person who wants to volley the returner serve, because everything just effectively sits up.
So my question is actually within one court. I'm having trouble with thinking this through. Within one court, must the front and back and side penthouses all have the same angle?
I don't know of a court which has different angles on, and it's possible to achieve. There'd be either longer or shorter penthouses if you did that. I don't know of any court that has done that.
Yeah, it seems like the join in the back corner would be odd if they were at a different angle somehow.
Okay, the next one is a little bit the same as the last, and it is rewarding the mix of delicacy and force. Apart from making the galleries smaller, are there length and width dimensions that how would you do if you were trying to encourage floor game? What would you do to the dimensions?
If you were trying to encourage the floor game, you'd make the court wider and you'd block up the galleries altogether.
I mean, in the end, like, I think what our game should be doing is talking about the balls and the rackets, and having more, input on those two things to help, encourage the floor game. We can build new courts to, be aware of that, but we have so many old courts that are not great for the floor game right now.
Yes, I agree with that, because again, when I started in tennis, we all had gut in the rackets, and you just could not string them to the tension they are today. So if you actually had a tournament, they do that in golf, where they have a hickory golf tournament where they all turn up and they're hitting them really good smacks 160 yards instead of the 425 they're doing on TV these days. But again, the gut racket, so was the development of the racket and also the gut, which made two enormous things. And I think, I think we need to address the ball going forwards. And again, I was the chairman of the Tennis and Rackets Association Equipment Committee back in, 89 or something, where Australians were developing a graphite racket, and I got the TNRA to agree to ban graphite. If we hadn't done that and you'd had another 30 years of development of graphite, I'd hate to think how these boys are how hard they'd be hitting it. It would be dangerous.
Okay, next up. It has always been, more advantageous to be at the serving end than at the receiving end. And basically everything, all the rules and so forth that exist relate to endeavoring to get to the serving end. If one were to, and I measured that in a little story the other day, as that advantage is the server, two equal players, the server would win 11 points out of 20, approximately 55% of the points. Chris, some months ago, you told me that it was not a good idea to build a court in which we changed the advantage from being at the serving end to being at the receiving end. Can you explain how we might have done that, even though we're not going to? What would you do? What would be the steps you would take if you wanted to reverse it and make the receiver have the advantage?
Well, as I was just saying just now, I would want to flatten the penthouse.
Got it.
So that any serve that came off was trickling off slowly or came off the back wall, and make the dead on 3 or 4 feet wider, so the person who has that easy shot off the penthouse just can smash it as hard as he can at a huge dead on. then you'd want to be at the hazard end.
Okay, so like a floor to bando dead on and a totally flat penthouse.
Yeah.
Got it.
Almost flat. The thing you don't want the ball to stick up there.
And I take you back to the gentleman that built Petworth, in that when he built Petworth, as I said, he made the net lower on the gallery side. He also reduced the width of the battery wall from the forehand corner of the dead on to the main wall. And I often go around to a courts and you just grab a racket and flip it end on end to how wide that is. And that court at Petworth is about a foot narrower or wider dead on, so less wall between the main wall and the battery wall. And it's so noticeable when you used to play Chris Bray down there, who was the head pro. You know, he used to pumple in that dead on all the time before today's people would do it. So if you had a tournament at Petworth today, I would think you'd have a dead on every single rally.
Chris, what about tinkering with the dimension of the tambour, diminishing it a little bit?
Good morning, Sam. In diminishing it in which way?
Making it a little narrower, harder to hit, so the server would have a smaller target.
Yes, and when we've looked at the court dimensions that were built between 1905 and 1912, that became very consistent at 2 foot 2 inches. There were some that were built at 2 foot, and Seacourt is one that is only, so if you're looking down the main wall, the timbre is only 2 foot wide instead of 2 foot 2. But again, that by changing that, you're altering the angle of the timbre as well. And one of the things that did come up in our discussions is that it is easier to get hazard chases by playing with the angle of the timbre, especially in doubles if someone's at the net. So again, we've been taking that into consideration. And also the length of the wall from the grill wall to the back edge of the timbre. Again, that is an area that varied a lot. And we found the Washington court was a less length in that than in a normal court, or not a normal court in versus other courts. So again, that we've looked at that for this new Washington court.
Bill Barker had a question that related to graphite rackets, and a question that is, how much faster do you think the ball, if the graphite rackets that you tried to avoid had existed, how much faster would the balls be going today?
We wouldn't be sitting here with Ivan only broken 1 bead of glass, but probably about 1 every month.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
I think by making the ball bigger and changing the weights, you can counteract the speed of the racket, and that's something maybe we need to be looking at going forwards. Because I remember when we used to play at Philadelphia, Chris said that the floor was very, very rough, but it was they also had very, very heavy balls, didn't they, Chris? You know, the home of the Whopper was what we used to call Philadelphia.
Home of the Whopper.
There's been a certain amount of conversation about evolution over the past 50, 75, and 100 years, going back to the player who appeared from 1850 and so forth. What would you expect over the coming 50, 75, or 100 years? And if you don't like what you expect, what would you do to avoid it?
I don't suppose there's any reason why there shouldn't be a continuance of the trend of people being bigger, stronger, faster, better physiology, more scientific approach to diet and everything, training.
Better shoes.
I think we've been through at a real accelerated rate over the last 40 years from when Chris came into the game, because when Chris was a professional, most of the professionals that came to the game were through Lords, where they went to the cricket at Lords, but they weren't good enough to get on the cricket. So they got palmed across the real tennis. And David Cull was one of the classics that he went there for cricket, but didn't. And he was left-handed. Back in the days when he became a pro, the first thing he was told, he's not allowed to do anything left-handed. So, but the speed of Cam and a couple of the players and the power that Rob Fay hits, like he doesn't have one foot on the ground when he hits a really hard shot. He's completely airborne. And I don't know. I don't think we'll see the change of the game that we've seen in the last 40 years. I don't think that will happen to the same degree in the next 40 years, personally. I think, anyway, who knows? But I think we've gone through the physical change and everything. I can't see it will change as much. But I remember being in Melbourne when we had the tournament in '75 when when the Bostwigs and Noddy Knox and all that lot came out and they played in the Bathurst Cup. And to see the Bostwigs and particularly Noddy Knox volleying a ball, return a serve off the penthouse, it was just poetry in motion. And we had Pierre there as well who gave a demonstration. And it was all a very long swing and beautifully volley. I would think they'd be shocked to see how Rob Fay, how hard he hits his volley return to serve these days.
Here's another question. How do we obviously have a bell curve of players with a very small number of people who are extraordinarily good and a very large number of people who are sort of average. How do you think about court design for different skill levels?
I don't think I do think about that very much. We all learn to play on it. If you play any other game, they also have bell curves, and the people in the middle of the bell curve at lawn tennis have to play on the same court as Roger Federer.
Right. Colin, any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's the attraction of our game. Like if you go along and watch a normal game of lawn tennis at a very low level, they have trouble getting the ball into the serve, and then they certainly enjoy hitting it up halfway up the back net, stop net. Whereas the great thing about real tennis, and it's throughout the whole world, it doesn't matter if you're an 80 handicapper or if you're a plus 20. The enjoyment you get from the game is just so obvious. And I think we're very lucky that the game adapts, and the handicap system again was a great equalizer. So I think we're very lucky in our sport.
Okay, that's pretty much the sort of prepared questions. There are a few other ones. Peter Pell, do you want to ask the one that you put in the chat feature?
Sure. Just back on equipment for a second. I think it's a terrific thing that you stopped graphite from coming into the game, because that would have changed everything. But if you could go back, are there additional restrictions that you would have recommended? And I'm thinking of, the reinforced Exotech rackets and/or you talked about the strings. Would you have, restricted that as well?
I wouldn't change the reinforcement of the racket, because I think that's been a very good thing for tennis as a whole, in that your rackets last so much longer. So I think that's been a positive thing. You don't want someone having to buy a racket every couple of months because they're cracking down the throat. So I think that the durability of the racket's been fantastic. Maybe the string tension could have been looked at, but the horse is already in the paddock, so we can't change that.
I think what the other sports would say, lawn tennis and squash especially, is they are slightly, or have been in the past, slightly envious of the way we restricted the size of the real tennis bat. Every other sport has greatly increased their surface area, making the ball easier to hit. But I've heard it said often by the officials of those sports that they wished they'd taken steps, as we did, to prevent the expansion of the head. And of course, those of us who go back to 1974 and remember the controversy of the World Championship in 1974 between Jimmy Bostwick and Howard Angus, when different size rackets were used. So I think we did pretty well in 1982 to establish that.
Jim Zug has asked a question, do we have a spreadsheet of all the 50 odd courts in the world and the dimensions of each? It's interesting, there is a book, Jim, that is referred to as Knoll and Clark, and it has a fold out that has these dimensions. There is a little bit of a challenge with that, and that is that some suggest that the dimensions might not be quite accurate. Apparently, I don't know this, but maybe Chris or Colin does, that when that was created, and I don't even know when that book was published.
That 1924.
1924?
100 years ago.
Okay, so apparently a word went out to each of the courts, please measure your dimensions, and there was a certain amount of inconsistency, so they may not be quite right. But today, an architect would have a device that they could just stand at the middle of the court and spin themselves around with a laser, and they'd have the precise dimensions. And it would actually be sort of an interesting thing to do, you know, in terms of putting together some sort of handbook for the next people who do it. I mean, we're doing something that is maybe less empirical and more field driven by, you know, getting Chris and Colin and a few others and this group together to talk about it. But you know, essentially that's what we're trying to do. Steve Hufford has asked a question that if Washington wants to win the Whitney Cup, and by the way, yes, we do, that we should create a court with dimensions that are halfway between the racket club's east and west courts, since that's where it's played. I suspect those dimensions are the same, but I would tell you, based on recent experience, the light levels in those two courts differs with under natural light circumstances. The difference between the east and west court is close to 30% difference in light.
Haven, in your dog and pony show, you have a photo of a it looks like something that's framed that is some court's dimensions though. Is that where is that from, or is that hung at?
It hangs at Princess Court. It's a picture that's you know 3 feet wide and 2 feet high, and somebody went and wrote down all the courts that existed sometime in the 1800s and wrote those down in a column, and then had all the dimensions in rows, and he went around and measured them himself. And I've always thought that was a fellow who seems to perhaps have had an unfortunate marriage, that he trekked all over the place to make all those measurements. We haven't, most of those courts, or at least many of those courts in that picture, don't exist anymore.
Right.
But it was an early effort at doing the same thing.
Well, it seems like we should have this for the game, right? That we should have this, you know, the exact measurements, if only for new courts being built. It seems like, especially if we lose courts. I mean, from 1924 to now, we've lost, you know, I don't know how many courts, Chris, you think we've lost, but you know, a couple dozen maybe, right?
It probably is that amount, yes. Mostly, I think.
Yeah. If Ryan wanted to share my screen, I can show you what we're talking about. But I can't do that. Only Ryan can share my screen. Ryan's in control.
Try it now.
There we go. So if you can see my screen now, can you see that or not?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep. So you'll see across the top, it's got the names of the courts. And this is at the back of the Knoll and Clark book. So they've got the years down here that the courts were built. And then they've got all the same measurements. So if you come down to here, the courts I was talking about are these lot here, which is 1906, 1907, 1911. And you'll see that those courts are all 110 foot 4 inches, very consistent in their lengths. Again, their widths very consistent, and all. So this is by this stage, they'd become very, the penthouses are the same. There's very little variance in those courts built around that period of time, compared to, if you go back to, where's one, Goodwood over here, 106 feet and 3 inches. Well, there's a hell of a difference between 100 and that's 4 foot difference just in the length, and the width was 35 foot, so 3 foot narrower. So again, I just go back to, they seem to, unfortunately, even though this book was printed in 1924 and Chicago was built in 1922 and New York in 1920s, it didn't get included in this, unfortunately. So we don't actually have this similar sort of thing. But, this was a very detailed, every single length you could possibly think of was all written down here. And this is when we were looking at this during our other meetings, that we found that the wall length from the grill to the back edge of the timbre was smaller than at other courts, at what the current Washington court compared to other courts. But again, down here, and I'll try to blow it up and then I'll shut up. But you can see here on the measurements of the timbres that, I was saying that there was a consistency in the depth of them there. So you can see that they're 2 foot 2 inches, 2 foot 2 foot 2 foot 2 inches, but the width is 1 foot 6. And then you go to this court here where it's 1 foot 6, which I think is C court from memory. Yeah, so C court is only 1 foot 6 wide, whereas the others were 1 foot 8, which doesn't sound very much. But I remember when I was playing C court, when I was not bad at the game, you'd suddenly be standing there and a ball would zip past the timbre that you thought was going to hit it, and you'd scratch your head and wonder why. And the reason is that it's 2 inches narrower. But at the time, I didn't know that. Anyway, that's great. I don't need to share anymore. Go back to normal.
General questions from anyone? Go ahead and speak up.
Bill Barker did ask a question in the email, and I just thought I'd like to pass on a bit of helpful knowledge to him. In that, one thing that I started as Chris Ronaldson's assistant in Melbourne in 1974, and one of the rules that he said to me is so important, Bill, which I think reading through your thing, you seem to have not been taught, and I'd love you to have a lesson with Chris. But that lesson would be, it's very important to win the last point, and I don't think you've picked up on that one.
Jim Zugg has on his book, as he signs every book with that, win the last point.
Always.
Always.
Always win the last point. Not some of the time.
As in tennis, as in life.
Temple, you had a question of Eric. Go ahead.
I just wanted to hear, Eric, I don't want to jump out at you, but you are the, guys like you and Noah and that crowd, our Van Allen Cup team. You guys are the future of our game. And I just wondered if you had some thoughts about why, not necessarily about the dimensions, but what is it about this game that intrigues you? Where do you think you're going to go with it? That type of thing. Again, I know I've sprung this on you, but I saw you on the Zoom and I thought I'd ask you. So if you've got some thoughts on it, I think all of us would like to hear it. Eric, you're what, 18? Are you there, Eric?
I'm not sure Eric's on the call anymore.
We might have lost Eric. I see Sam had to leave as well.
Eric had to go to class at 11:45.
Okay.
I'll be sure to have him give you his answer.
Wow.
Okay. Jake has a question on the grit of the court and how the question really of painting, coating, dealing with the floor, that's a little bit different from dimensions. I'm wondering also as a sort of a follow-up to that, whether we should have another conversation like this about surfaces and coatings and so forth. Those do have cost consequences where the dimensions do not, but they're really interesting as well. How do you think, I guess that really is, how do you think about speed of the court? Chris, Colin?
I think we can touch on it now. Like, there's a lot of thought gone into this, and with Peter Luck-Hilly's building of the court at the Middlesex University and also then at Wellington, there's been a lot of modern technology and knowledge gained by doing that. I think Peter's redone the walls at Wellington, I think 3 times. The walls at Chris's court at Radley, the battery walls I'm talking below the penthouse, in his view, weren't done very well, and they have to keep replastering. So I think the knowledge, and also we learned a lot through doing Chicago. So I think we've got the right surfaces for the courts, which we've relearned that was lost during the 70 years. Melbourne was very lucky in that they did a precast concrete, they cast the concrete in stitute, but the modern surface called the armor coat, which they're putting on the top of the breeze blocks, is standing up well at courts like Chicago, and that is definitely the way to be going. But I'll let Chris answer a bit.
I was introduced just a month ago to the concept of grit. Bruce Paxton, who has been doing the court at Morton Morrell, said that we need to have 400 grit, and he's a floor expert, so that's gone into my brain. Don't really know what it means. I do know that what you want is a court which is fast enough that the ball comes through on it, but slow enough so that the player doesn't fall over. So it wants to be slippery, but not so slippery that you can't stand up on it.
Haven, it's Howard. I'm just joining. I'm sorry, I had a different Zoom conference.
Oh, too bad.
Too bad.
Well, we've recorded this one. And so you'll be able to watch it later.
All right.
Okay. Are there other questions? We're in the sort of general round. We're approaching the top of the hour. If people have to move on to other things, carry on. And otherwise, if you have a question, just why don't you try shouting it out, and then we'll wrap it up.
I'd like to just go back to the earlier question, which was, I don't know which people are the young people on this particular call, but I know that to develop cut in tennis takes a lot of work. And I just wonder if today's youth are opting for the harder hitting rather than the hard slog of learning to cut the ball, because the cut actually doesn't reward as much as hitting accurately very high, which they see, you know, Rob Fay and Steve Vagona and all those ones doing. So they see that's the way to play the game. How do the young people see the game that have come in these days? Are they seeing it more as a bang, bang, bang game, or more, because I remember the days, you know, you used to go and play some 80-year-old fella, you'd walk on court with him, and next thing you know, you've lost 6-1, 6-2 because you kept bashing the ball around and he was just, you know, getting it a nice length.
That's why I wanted to talk to Eric. Yeah.
Well,
yes, Shane is not here.
I could only say from the father of Noah, who hits the ball fairly hard. Initially, it seemed that hitting the ball hard was the most advantageous way of hitting it up. And certainly he was winning a lot of points that way, but he's trying to change his game a bit to have it a mix of both cut and power. It's very interesting just to watch that progression, but certainly power is the biggest weapon that he has at the moment. And I think Bill can speak to Eric's game a little bit as well, but it seems as power is really what's emphasized most. Would you think?
Yes, and you see that where a lawn tennis player comes along, in that they'll take up the game of real tennis and they'll cut everything off for the back wall and they'll get down to about 30 handicap. And then they'll suddenly find that they're not improving anymore. And what they actually have to do is unlearn a little bit, and they've got to go back up to a 35 because they've got to start using their back wall. So the game teaches people with time that cutting off and volleying everything is all right at the 60s, 70s level, but as soon as you get down a bit lower, you need to learn to also have the back wall. So I just wonder if today's players are just so strong and be able to hit so hard that they're not learning the traditional cut game.
So this is Josh Shearer from the Tuxedo Club, and I'm not one of the young players, as you can probably tell. But I will say, Tim Chisholm is obviously our pro. He can hit the ball just about as hard as anyone. But he, from my perspective, knows how to cut extremely well and teaches that to our juniors. And so I'll just speaking, for Tuxedo, I do think our youth are being taught to cut and not just rely on heavy hitting.
That's great to hear.
John Patton has the classic barroom question that occurs in all sports. JP, why don't you ask Chris and Colin the question that you posted in the chat?
Yeah, sure. Just along the power versus finesse debate, we're talking a lot about how we can use equipment and the court dimensions and galleries to restrict power. I'm wondering, is the emphasis that the game is placed on power, whether just by watching Fay and Bergona, if there were to be an equal emphasis on finesse, on cut, on some of the classical elements of the game, and you had the equivalent of Rob Fay skilled counterweight, and I'm thinking Pierre, who do you think would win? And I'm just curious if Chris or Colin has an opinion on that. I'm sure other people have asked the same question over the years.
I'm afraid I didn't get all that. I had some bad reception there.
Put him on the spot. Jeez.
He's saying, how would Rob Fay do against you today if you were playing in your peak?
If Rob Fay at his peak played me at my peak, I lose 6-1, 6-2.
And I wouldn't get a game.
Is that because of the different style games, or?
It's just the power they hit the ball. It's just, the speed around the court, the accuracy. Again, you've got a very Rob Fay is a very, very unique, talented person. His eye-hand coordination is, right up there. Chris and I, unfortunately, didn't have probably as good an eye-hand coordination. Graham Highland did, but Graham just always used to come up with a new idea of how to play tennis next week from this week. So he didn't. But Rob is an exceptional person, and Cam as well. But Rob is the one that stands out for having been world champion for so long. Just great eye-hand coordination.
Steve Sater had a question about Philadelphia, or possibly a comment about Philadelphia. Do we still have Steve, or have we lost him?
Showing there, but he's muted.
There you go.
Sorry. Well, we're going to have to skip that one. Okay. Well, it's slightly past noon. Thank you very much to Chris, to Colin, to Ryan, and Ivan for helping to make this possible. Thank you to all of the rest of you for coming along and asking such excellent questions. I suppose I should close by reminding people that 98% of the way to the finish line is pretty good, but it's not the finish line. And I know looking at many of these names, I know that many of you have been very supportive and helpful. I really, I'd like to single out Josh Shearer for leading an effort in Tuxedo that has been absolutely heroic and far, far beyond expectations, and really just got some people together who called up their friends and did the work, and it was extremely impressive and a really terrific effort. But we have the USCTA auction is coming up for a week from beginning tomorrow and extending for a week. There is the USCTA dinner, and you know, I think that there's going to be a certain amount that is going to be aimed towards this project. It is looking extremely good, but it's not quite there. So if by any chance you haven't given, go WashingtonCourtTennis.com, the U.S. Court Tennis Preservation Foundation, usctpf.org. They're easily found, and boy, are they welcoming. I think Ryan probably put 40 donate now buttons on the WashingtonCourtTennis.com website. So thank you all very much for what has been a terrific conversation. Maybe as we move on into the winter, we'll do one on the sort of surfaces and materials and get into some more questions about grit and so forth. But this has been terrific, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Haven.
Thank you for hosting it, Haven. Thanks for all your work you put in.